Hi there, welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh. This is Gizmo and Widget, my travelling companions. And welcome back to our series, Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. We're travelling on your behalf through the centre of the Cotswolds, seeking out smaller places you might easily not come across, little villages, churches, even the occasional artefact. Come with us and let's go and find some wonderful Cotswold gems. It's a great day for me today. You find Ross, Widget, Gizmo and me in the little village of Ampney Crucis. And we're having a nice time walking around, but it's made particularly wonderful by my very special guest today. It's half term, so I have with me the two greatest grandchildren in the world, Matilda and Huxley. Hello. Say hello. There they are. Hello. I know it's very disappointing for all you grandparents around the world to realise that, after all, these are the finest children in the world. But there you go, it's just one of those things. We're going to show you around this extraordinary village. It's interesting, actually, because the church is great and fascinating, but the village is very definitely not easy to visit because there's very, very little parking. Come with me. The Ampney villages, of which there are 3, are named after the Ampney Brook that runs through them. They straddle the A417 that runs between Fairford and Cheltenham, and I must have driven past and through them thousands of times. Somehow, I've never dropped off the main road in order to visit them. My mistake. Today, we're visiting 2 of them. Ampney Crucis, which for some reason I've always assumed was the largest, and Ampney St Mary, which is very definitely the smallest. As usual, the village is gathered around a substantial manor house, with the church close to it, and an assortment of pretty Cotswold cottages, interspersed with cottages and houses from all ages, all on the bank of the brook. The house, called Ampney Park, was probably here in some form before the beginning of the 16th century, but was bought and expanded by the Pleydell family in 1562. It has had a checkered history under varied ownership. In the early 18th century, it was owned by Viscount Down from Yorkshire. It seems the Cotswolds has always been a perfect second home option. In the 1760s, it was bought by the Blackwell family, who stayed until the end of the 19th century. They made all kinds of additions and alterations to the house, before eventually selling on to the locally well-known Cripps family, who built on a billiard room with stained glass windows featuring the arms of all the previous owners. The result is a very interesting architectural hodgepodge, which in the 20th century has spent time as an accommodation block for the students of Cirencester Agricultural College, and even a stint as an hotel. It was subsequently rescued in 1997 by the businessman Edward Scott and his wife Angela, who put the house into excellent order and built some great equestrian facilities. Edward Scott died soon after the job was finished, and his wife lived there alone until 2018, when she decided to put it on the market. As far as I can tell, it's now in private hands, but being done up to offer a top-end wedding and party venue. The gardens are wonderful and roll down to the brook. And right next door is the church, unusually dedicated to the Holy Rood, or cross. This church is also a fascinating hodgepodge. David Very, who wrote the latest edition of Pevner's Architectural Guide to the area, writes, "The first impression is mainly perpendicular," which is roughly the period between 1330 and 1530, but the church contains features of all periods from Saxon to 19th century. As you walk through the gate into the churchyard, the first thing you see is a very rare, complete churchyard cross. Almost all these crosses were decapitated by the iconoclasts of the 16th century Reformation. This one appeared to have suffered the same fate, until in 1860 the top of the cross was discovered walled up in the old rood stairway in the church. The huge difference in condition between the steps and shaft and the top is a testament to what 300 years of weather can do to the Cotswold stone. This cross is worth looking at closely, as the little sculptures in the panels of the cross are incredible. The three-stage 15th century tower has some great gargoyles, allowing me the luxury of boring my poor long-suffering grandchildren with an explanation of their purpose. So, what they did is they made gargoyles. You see those men right at the top there, on the edge. There's a sort of strange face with, and he has, with an open mouth. And there's one in each corner, okay? And the water would land on the top of the church, and it would come out through a hole just behind that gargoyle and out of the gargoyle's mouth. And the point about the gargoyle is that it stands out from the wall, so the water comes out of its mouth and then down and onto the ground and not down the wall of the house. So that's what gargoyles are for. Exactly. Also in the churchyard is what appears to be an ancient font, seemingly being used as a well cover and planter. Inside, the church treasures continue. 14th century wall painting, indistinct but exciting nonetheless, can be found in several parts of the church. It always amazes me when we discover these wonderful echoes from a time so long ago that it's hard even to imagine the people who made them, let alone the strength of religious devotion that inspired them. The aforementioned rood stair door is clearly original. Several good monuments adorn the walls, and a brilliant tomb chest with two recumbent effigies of George Lloyd wearing armour and his wife, who died in 1584. Along the frieze at the bottom are images of their 5 sons and 7 daughters. This church has been a good introduction to Matilda and Huxley. Just enough stories to keep them interested. I'll have them taking over the Cotswold exploring sooner than you think. Our next quick visit, however, is even more fascinating. Half a mile or so up the road, sitting all on its own in the middle of a field, is the church of Ampney St Mary. Its village would seem to have deserted it during the Black Death, a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague that killed millions of people in Europe and Asia from 1346 to 1353. The village moved just under a mile away and is now called Ashbrook. The church's isolation did it no favours over the years until, in 1913, the ivy that had completely engulfed the building was removed and the church was brought back to life. Weirdly, as is so often the case, it was the church's neglect that was its saviour. The wall paintings in this building are absolutely wonderful. It takes a while to get your eye in, but at the eastern end of the north wall there's a giant St Christopher, another on the north nave wall of St George and the Dragon watched over by the King and Queen. My favourite is on the south wall, a warning to Sabbath breakers, featuring the Christ with injuries to his face, surrounded by implements of the various trades, a wheelwright checking a spoke is straight and true, a mallet, a horn, and various others, all giving the message that if you work on a Sunday, you injure the Son of God. Wow. All of this, and the fact that both Matilda and Huxley bravely stood still while the drone took off from their hands made this a wonderful visit. My thanks go to them for their unending patience. Half-term is a wonderful thing. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Ampney Crucis and this extraordinary bonus of this little beautiful ancient church in Ampney St Mary just across the road. We've had a lovely time. It's been a very nice trip.
Don't forget to subscribe
and hit the notification bell.
Thank you very much, guys. It's been wonderful having you with me, and we will see you again very soon, somewhere else in the Cotswolds. We're now heading for the village of Kempsford, where another great village in an unexpected place reveals its treasures. This is an intriguing place. At one stage, many years ago, it was an important place. You can tell that by the breathtaking church you see behind me. It still is an important place for now, but now for an entirely different reason. We're going to show you around and explain what I mean. Come with me. This village, which, to my shame, I had until today never visited, has a history of outstanding fascination. So gripped have I been reading the historical account, I'm 48 hours late in providing Ross with the dub for this film. I hope one day he'll forgive me for making him work so hard on a Sunday morning. Sandwiched between Fairford Airport and the embryonic River Thames, this place has suffered a little in the 20th century. It's gone from being a spectacularly important hub of grand, not to say royal, activity, to a place out of the way and a little overrun by the Royal Air Force, but comfortable in its past glories. Comparatively recently, it was an important stop on the canal built in the 1780s, which ran between the rivers Severn and Thames, an incredibly ambitious bit of engineering that cut through the Cotswold watershed with a tunnel at Sapperton, the longest tunnel in Britain. But can I start, because this is not the place to give you a full history of this extraordinary village, by pointing you in the direction of the village website. I'm stealing so much of the stuff I'm about to relate from them, and at the same time only scratching the surface. I really want to emphasize the help they've given me. It's a simple address to remember: Kempsford.net. My thanks to them, and please do go and have a look. Its proximity to the River Thames almost certainly, there are very few certainties in this story, so almost certainly explains the name of this village. There is still a ford across the river that has a serious reputation for treachery. Henry, the young son of the Duke of Lancaster, drowned in the ford because he didn't take seriously enough the dangers of this sandy-bottomed river. In the days when the kingdoms of Mercia and that of the West Saxons were at loggerheads, constantly raiding one another and looting and raping in the way they did in those days, this place was a frontier settlement. A considerable castle was built on the north side of the river to protect the ford. Remnants of it still exist in the garden of the house beside the church. You can tell the ancient lineage of this place when I tell you that ownership from 800 AD onwards was in the hands of people called things like Ethelmund, Earldorman of the Huitians, who was fighting the Wiltshire heathens under the leadership of Beorhtric, king of the West Saxons and war. Can't you just picture them, wrapped in furs against the cold and carrying weapons wherever they went? I don't know, maybe I watched too much telly. Later, Ernulf of Hesdin granted the church to the Abbey of Gloucester, and by 1297 the manor had passed by marriage to Henry Plantagenet, Earl of Lancaster, Now, any of you who've spent time in an English school will know the name Plantagenet and its links to the English throne. This place has very royal connections. Surely that explains the wonderful grandeur of the church. In 1359, at the age of 19, Blanche, the daughter of the Duke of Lancaster, married John of Gaunt, another name English history students will remember, who eventually built the extraordinary tower in the church in memory of his Blanche, who died of the plague. This church is unusually grand. Here, I'm going to quote directly from the village history, written by the Reverend A.B. Miners, who, I must assume, was or is rector or vicar here. He wrote, "It is worthwhile to look back and note the number of men and women, prominent abroad as well as at home, who have been closely connected with Kempsford. It is to the present writer a constant source, not of interest merely, but of inspiration, to think of all those who during the past 800 years have knelt in worship within the walls of the church. A stately throng crossing the castle green from the great house and entering by the south porch. Edward I, often, Edward II, probably as a prisoner, Edward III, perhaps as a boy, and Henry IV, certainly. Then those great nobles with their wide-flung possessions and influence in church and state, at home and in France, for good or for evil. The Cadurcis, the Plantagenets, and the Finns. Chaucer, too, the first great English poet, and John of Gaunt's foreign wife, Constance, daughter of the King of Spain, and Philippa, John's daughter, wife of the King of Portugal. The northwest boundary of Kempsford is dominated by the airfield of Royal Air Force Fairford, with its main runway extending across the centre of the parish. This airfield is only occasionally used now by the United States Air Force. However, it is still allocated the biennial Royal International Air Tattoo, which attracts many thousands of visitors. In 1944, Fairford Airfield was opened as a troop transportation centre, and development of the area really gathered pace. In 1950, the airbase was taken over by the United States Air Force and handed back to the Royal Air Force in 1964. It was later used for the testing of the Concorde supersonic airliner. It reverted to the United States in 1976 and was in use by B-52 bombers during the Gulf War in 1991. Since 1970, there's been much building development and infilling, changing the character of the village, but the church remains spectacular. The royal link may be long gone, but the church still stands as symbol of the importance of Kempsford's past. Its architectural style is unique in Gloucestershire, but its outstanding feature is the carved and painted ceiling of the medieval tower, recently restored with the help of a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund, and it now glows and gleams in glory. The soaring chancel arch seems to me to set the tone. Exceptional choir stalls, wrought iron screen south of the sanctuary, brass communion rail and Minton floor tiles are probably by G.E. Street from the 1850s. There's a lovely wrought iron hourglass by the pulpit, a useful aid to foreshortening the over-enthusiastic preacher, and some interesting Puritan text boards at the west end of the nave. There are some good monuments, including a reclining figure of a priest and a classic medieval brass, but perhaps the most interesting monument in this church is invisible. When the organ was installed, it covered up an important grave belonging to Lord Coleraine, which inspired John Betjeman to tell David Veary, the author of the revised edition of Pevsner's Architectural Guide to the Cotswolds, "If you write about Kempsford, you must not neglect to say that there is an Irish peer buried inside the organ, which is the only place known to me where such has occurred." Betjeman was always something of a card. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip round Kempsford. It's difficult actually standing here to get an idea of how close to the river it is. But of course, as its name implies, it's named after the ford across the River Thames. From Kempsford, we're heading round the other side of the aerodrome to the village of Maisie Hampton. Now, I have to admit, I'd not heard of this village before, and driving into it perhaps explained why it's clearly been taken over by the local industry, which is the Royal Air Force and the American Air Force at various times. It's very close to an airfield, but the centre of the village is just as sleepy and Cotswold-like as ever it could be. We're going to show you around. Come with me. This area of the Cotswolds, just on the border of Wiltshire and close to the embryonic River Thames, was once, much like any other part of the central Cotswolds, made up of little village communities, usually run by rich estates, either monastic or secular, and you could travel slowly amongst them, enjoying the beautiful buildings undisturbed. In the 20th century, under the cloud of World War, several aerodromes were built, as far from the coast as possible, making use of any flat land on the top of the hills or, as in the case of Maisie Hampton, the valley of the River Thames. By no means all of them exist these days, but Fairford, just a couple of miles from here, has grown and spread until it has become impossible not to feel the effect of this vast organisation. The Royal Air Force and a strong American presence has meant that large numbers of personnel needed accommodation, and the villages have hugely expanded. Almost hiding in the middle of these 20th century housing estates, however, you can still find the remnants of the Cotswold treasures we find elsewhere. The green at the centre of Maisie Hampton is a lovely classic village green. The pub, the Mason's Arms, right on the green, is a traditional village pub with food and accommodation. My guess is that they do very well with the airfield nearby. Certainly their homemade arancini, made with smoked cheddar and chorizo, were delicious. I think I'm right in saying that the landlord is the chef. It's often a good scenario. The houses around the green seem quite grand and largely unchanged. In the middle of the green is a high-standing water pump with stone steps up to it, which was designed to fill agricultural and domestic water bowers on horse-drawn carts. Down a lane, a few hundred yards north of the green, on a sort of raised promontory, is the village church. A phrase that doesn't really do it justice. As you approach the church, there is a village pond full of wildlife, an interesting aspect to the north, and a fence to lean on to admire the view, giving just a hint as to the proximity of the airfield. But the eye is then drawn to this lovely 13th century cruciform church with a central tower. The graveyard is beautifully tended, or was on the cold January day we pitched up. This church was built by the Knights Templar in 1269, with a chancel almost as long as the nave, and transepts north and south. All very promising so far. Once inside, the fun really begins. As you will know if you've seen any of our stuff in the past, these local churches sometimes contain very surprising treasures. This one is what the Americans would call a doozy. My grandmother, by the way, was American, so I feel justified in the cultural appropriation. The monument in the south transept is worth travelling a long way for. I have a favourite blog called English Buildings on Blogspot, written by Philip Wilkinson, a brilliant local author, and his description of this monument is irresistible. I'm sure he will forgive me if I quote him. Here's a wonderful example of the architecture of church monuments. It's a monument of James Vaux, a physician, and his two wives, Editha on his right and Philippe, a Jacobean Philippa presumably, on his left. The portraits of the three are charming. Vaux in his doctor's gown and pointed beard, resting his arm on a skull and leaning towards his first wife, whose head is slightly inclined towards him. Philippa stares ahead, by contrast, looking life in the face. She has no skull and carries a protective pomander. She survived her husband and lived to marry again. I find these figures rather moving, and the nuances of pose that the sculptor allowed himself, or was allowed by eldest son Francis, who commissioned the monument, very English in their restraint. Below them are tiny images of the children. Editha's 12. My, how these women worked at childbirth. And Philippe's 4. Some shown in bed, presumably died before their father. Above, amongst the pediments at the top of the monument, are figures of the virtues. And then there is the architecture. Look at the way the sculptor has invoked the panoply of Jacobean classicism. Pediments variously shaped, scrolls, composite columns, panels, keystones, cartouches, cherubim with winged heads, niches, to frame and display his subjects. He was able to add colour, too, reminding us that even in the supposedly restrained phase of the English church, things were brighter and more vivid than we sometimes think. It all adds up to a grand monument, but in a rough-hewn, provincial manner. Perhaps this is right for its subject. Vaux was eminent, but didn't make it to the top job of royal physician. When King James asked him how he knew how to heal, the doctor replied that he had learned by practice. "Then by my soul thou hast killed many a man," responded James. "Thou shalt no practice on me." The Church Monument Society concludes their description of this extraordinary piece of bling as follows. As with so many monuments, it is not an end in itself, but a link in a chain, and great fun can be had in trying to trace the interrelations between families. Dr. Vaux's last wife, Philippe, is not buried with him, as she subsequently married a Bainham, an illustrious local family. When she died in 1631, her then-husband placed a laudatory epitaph on her gravestone in St. James's Church in Staunton, then in Worcestershire, now in Gloucestershire. She also appears amongst the 3 kneeling daughters on the monument of her father, William Horton, who died in 1615, also in St. James's Church. Thus, she is commemorated on 3 different memorials. I'm absolutely sure she was worth it. This lovely monument, whilst captivating, shouldn't stop you noticing the wonderful stonework on the south side of the chancel, which, whilst probably moved at some stage during the life of the church, showed just how seriously the Knights Templar took their faith. The font is a 19th century addition by Brooks, who also provided the reredos, the pews and stalls, along with the tiling on the floor. The pulpit is 20th century, provided along with the communicants' kneelers. It's a lovely church, this, and just demonstrates why we find ourselves so often concentrating on the ecclesiastical buildings in a village. It's hard, if not impossible, to find anything remotely as interesting in the later extension of this settlement. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Macyhampton. It is interesting. It's definitely a village of 2 parts, because there is a large amount of housing here, mainly 20th century housing, but in the middle of it is this extraordinary little village and this lovely church with its extraordinary stonework. Slightly further north now, to the village of Southrop, where a familiar pub and an exciting new business add interest to a beautiful valley village. For years, when I was a wine merchant in this part of the world, I used to come here and drink and eat in the Swan at Southrop. It became synonymous with comfort and good food. The village is absolutely beautiful. It's home to one of the 3 great hospitality establishments in the Cotswolds. New they are. One of them is called Estelle Manor. That's the other side of Witney. Another is called Soho Farmhouse, which of course you may well have heard of. That's down near Great Kew. And here, Time, in this beautiful sleepy village, is a fantastically grand, wonderful place where you can eat and shop and have a conference. We're going to show you around the village. Come with me. It's an interesting business for me to visit with my Cotswold Explorer hat on, a village I've been coming to for years. The vast majority of our exploration is to places I might have visited once or conceivably twice, but never really paying much attention. I revel in the process of exploration without ever being surprised by my lack of knowledge. I've been coming to Southrop to eat and drink at the Swan since I first came to work in Oxford as a wine merchant in 1985. They were for a while a valued customer. I felt, until today, that the village was a place with which I was familiar. I was wrong. I wasn't aware of the beautiful water meadows that bordered the village on the east, where an ancient bridge, built in 1379, spans the River Leach, carries the road from Filkins, and draws you to see the complex but derelict system of sluices and streams that clearly, from medieval times, fed a mill, probably some reed beds, and perhaps even some watercress beds. From 1086, the village was named Leach, after the river, and it wasn't until 1211 that the name Southrop seems to have been adopted. Indeed, the boundary between the parishes of East Leach and Southrop were not properly defined until the enclosure of Southrop in 1621. We're less than a mile west of the 2 little villages of East Leach, which we visited a few years ago, discovering one of the Cotswolds' most delightfully peaceful places, with 2 churches on opposite sides of the river, joined by a stone clapper bridge, the likes of which at the time I'd never come across. It's worth looking at our film about it. Southrop turns out to be no less stunning. As we stood by the bridge, we spotted a figure walking across the meadow, pushing a wheelbarrow, accompanied by 2 gambling dogs, certainly one of which was a Labrador, And we like to think that we'd caught a glimpse of the man who, with his wife, owns the extraordinary manor house around which this village is gathered. The Southwark estate was part of the Roman settlements in this area, and naturally appears in the Domesday Book after 1066. It was, like most properties of this kind, owned by a monastery, in this case St Mary in Leicestershire, until the dissolution, when it became the property of the Crown, and then Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, Sir Robert Cecil. The Wadham family bought it in 1608, and after Dorothy Wadham founded the college in Oxford in her husband's name after his death, she gave the estate in totality to the college. In 2002, Jerry and Karen Hibbert bought the main house, and subsequently all the magnificent buildings around it, including the enormous tithe barn. And Karen set about restoring the whole estate and turning it into what is now one of the most respected hotels, restaurants and conference centres in the whole of the Cotswolds. They are invariably mentioned in the same breath as Soho Farmhouse, Daylesford and Estelle Manor, the latter of which, of course, isn't in the Cotswolds at all, however much they may wish it was. The pub, the aforementioned Swan, was bought by the Hibberts, and during COVID they took the opportunity to give it a thorough facelift. It remains an excellent traditional village pub, but with a little stardust sprinkled on it from the rest of the Time estate, not least from its executive chef, Charlie Hibbert, who runs the entire estate's catering operation. This is a true family affair. The cottages in the village are mainly 17th and 18th century, classic Cotswold stone walls with stone-tiled roofs. The Norman church, right next to the manor house, and conveniently for the Hibberts' privacy, separating it from the slightly more commercial side of the estate, is a startling discovery for your Cotswold explorer. The north and south walls are built extensively in a herringbone fashion, which you often see in small areas, but rarely on this scale. It may suggest Norman builders using Saxon workers. The Norman doorway, protected by its 14th century porch, is still beautifully conserved, and inside lies perhaps the most wonderful font we have come across in our travels. Pevsner, in the invaluable architectural guide that keeps me on the straight and narrow, writes of this font as follows: "One of the greatest treasures of the Cotswold churches, probably around 1180, but sculpted with far greater freedom than other local figured Norman tub fonts. This and its considerable iconographic sophistication reflect the gradual infiltration of French art, perhaps via Malmesbury. The figures are framed in trefoiled arcading with turrets or castles in the spandrels. On the east side, Moses with the tablets of the law, flanked by ecclesia with a chalice and pennoned cross, and synagogue blindfolded by the pennon of her broken staff. The remaining arches hold figures of armoured women, representing the virtues, trampling on the opposite vices. Modestia tramples on ebrietas, excess. Paciencia on ira, wrath. Largitas, which is generosity, on avaricia. Temperantia on luxuria. Misericordia, pity, on invidia, envy. It truly is an exceptional piece of work for a parish church. There is a 20th century choir screen and pulpit, some fragments of ancient glass in the windows, and a couple of good stone effigies in the sanctuary, thought to be Sir Thomas Conway, who died in 1606, and his wife Elizabeth. The effigies were probably carved before their deaths. There's lots to be found in the churchyard too. Some excellent chest tombs and a brilliant view of the manor, as well as the barns and buildings of the Time complex. This visit has been a treat. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Southwark. It's really pretty here, very watery. Lots of waterways of various kinds on this stream. And of course, we're close to the Thames, and it's a really wonderful place to come and visit. A lot further north now, Lower Lemington is our next destination, a tiny hamlet with a stunning little church. We're in an extraordinary little hamlet called Lower Lemington. It's called Lower Lemington to distinguish it, obviously, from Upper Lemington, which nowadays is really only one house. But this little tiny place, which probably used to be slightly bigger than it is now, is absolutely typical of the most remote of the Cotswold villages. There's a church behind Ross, which we're going to tell you about in a minute or two. We're going to show you around. Come with me. Little more than a farmyard, a few cottages and a couple of quite grand homes gathered around the church, Little Lemington is the sort of place that gives you an initial impression that nothing much can possibly have ever happened here. It's been fascinating for me to discover that whilst this little place hasn't exactly influenced world affairs, it has certainly been buffeted by the upheavals of English history from early medieval times and probably earlier. The ancient parish of Lemington, just a smidgen northeast of Moreton-in-Marsh, includes the Moreton Airfield, where Lancaster bomber pilots were trained in the Second World War, and where now firefighters from all over the country are trained. It was bounded to the west by a short stretch of the Fosse Way, one of the premier Roman roads built in the 2nd century AD, and which runs all the way from Exeter to Lincoln. It goes up to the 4 Shire Stone, which marks the point where the 4 English counties of Warwickshire, Oxfordshire, Gloucestershire and Worcestershire once met. I say once because in 1931 the boundaries were altered, so the latter county, Worcestershire, no longer meets the others at the stone. This stone, unique in England, is thought to be the inspiration for Tolkien's 3 Farthings stone, a central point in the Shire where 3 farthings met. The neglected and battered stone pillar was restored in 2022 thanks to the efforts of James Hayman Joyce and his team, who set himself the project when he sort of retired. It's only a mile or so from here and quite splendid, worth a detour. In 715 AD, 2 Saxon lords, Dodo and Oddo, really those were their names, founded Tewkesbury Abbey. Dodo gave the abbey land, including Lemington, and Stanway, which we have of course visited before and will be again very shortly. And until the 16th century, Lemington was run from Stanway Church. That association broke when Thomas Cromwell arranged for Stanway to be leased to the Tracy family in February 1533. More of that story when we publish our new film about Stanway House next month. Lemington became a crown property at the Reformation and passed through many hands subsequently, until it was bought by Lord Redesdale in 1811, becoming part of the Batsford estate, which it remains to this day. The church, originally Norman and dedicated to St. Leonard, a French monastic saint, patron saint of prisoners, who died in 559 AD, was badly damaged during the 17th century Civil War. At the time, it was reported to have been demolished by cannon fire, but obviously that was an exaggeration, as a good deal of the original church still stands. There is, however, a mass grave in the churchyard, thought to be a Civil War battle grave. I haven't been able to find details of the battle itself, but it gives us a hint as to how widespread the damage was during this violent time. The obvious earthworks northeast of the church strongly suggest there were once several more houses in this settlement. It's clear that the village has experienced serious ups and downs. The church itself has a chancel and nave, a south porch, and a large bellcote above the chancel arch. This arch, almost certainly Saxon, is only 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. There are a couple of very rough holes in the walls on each side, intended as primitive squints, those architectural tricks allowing people sitting in the sides of the aisles to catch at least a glimpse of what was occurring at the altar. There's a wonderful royal arms over the arch, put there in 1815 to commemorate Wellington's victory over Napoleon at Waterloo, and restored in 1985. Above the altar, beautifully crafted renditions of the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed were erected in the 18th century, when the lovely box pews were also installed. The stained glass is lovely, but Victorian or later. The tub font, sitting on the floor in the chancel for at least the last 70 years, is 12th century. These days, a much smaller 19th century octagonal font is used for local christenings. The pulpit is a kind of double-decker construction with a reading desk underneath. It's been altered over time, making it more easily accessible for the preacher. Clearly, the church has been much loved and looked after, despite considerable adversity, so it's a little odd to discover that a bequest in 1513 of money to build a tower was never used to do so. Perhaps it's lucky. It might have made a bigger target for the Civil War gunners. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Lower Lemington. It's a tiny, tiny place, but once you know the story of the battle fought here in the Civil War, it creates a really interesting and serious atmosphere. We've enjoyed being here. No more than a mile or so away, and part of the same estate on the edge of Moreton in Marsh, is the village of Batsford, home to an amazing arboretum. Now this is an interesting place because it's private. It's owned by the estate on which it sits. There's a very famous arboretum here, which is quite remarkable and worth a visit. It's a beautiful little village, and we're going to show you around. Batsford is a village just outside Moreton in Marsh. It's part of an estate with an extremely distinguished past, involving some of the most controversial figures in our recent history. Featuring the Mitford sisters and their family, almost equally famous and infamous, who we have, of course, come across before in the Cotswolds, not least in the village of Swinbrook, where, you may remember, we also found those extraordinary effigies of the Fetiplas family, lying on their sides, propped on their elbows, stacked 3 deep. And following them, the Wills family, who I suppose in this age are controversial because of their tobacco connections. Visiting Batsford village is an odd one. It's small, extremely pretty, but very private. It belongs, in its entirety, to the Batsford estate, which is a Cotswold estate in the grand manner, which would almost certainly, were it not for the second Lord Dulverton, the then head of the aforementioned Wills family, be entirely off limits to the public. In 1992, he set up the Batsford Foundation, a charitable trust to look after the extraordinary arboretum he had taken a good deal of his life creating. The Batsford Arboretum, at pains to point out that it is no longer part of the estate, is open most of the time to us all, and is an extraordinary place to visit. Their website is as informative as you would expect about opening times and costs. So, unusually, our advice is to visit the village through the Arboretum. The truth is, the sleepy little place tries pretty hard to deter casual visitors by car, with signs everywhere emphasizing the private nature of the place. It's understandable, because a motorized influx of any proportion would make life in this village impossible. Also, of course, you can catch a glimpse of the great manor house from the public footpaths which run through the estate. If you find yourself in the village, you will see a group of Victorian mock Tudor cottages gathered round the base of the Church of St Mary, also built in the 19th century. We happen to know that despite their appearance, these cottages are mostly run on the most modern ecological lines, biomass heating and a water supply from the springs on the land, suitably processed, of course. As I said, this estate is run in the grand manner. Perhaps the most spectacular building in the village is the old stable block. It's a surprisingly long way from the main house and appears now to be home to a horse breeding stud. Built in 1878 by Sir Ernest George, the arched entrance has an oriel window above it, and if you look at the dormer gables, you'll see round medallions with the letters FM entwined with flowers, which stand for Freeman Mitford. The Church of St Mary, high up on a knoll above the cottages, was rebuilt in the 1860s by the architects Poulton and Woodman from Reading. I know that architects admire and often love this building. It's apparently known as Neo-Norman in style, and has a series of complicated architectural details of which, if I'm honest, I'm not really a fan. I think it has something to do with the fact that the ornate tower and spire are tacked on to the southwest corner of the body of the otherwise externally plain church, making the body of the place look, from the outside at least, rather like a village hall. Inside, I should say, we were greeted with a thoughtfully placed portable CD player, or what I seem to remember calling a ghetto blaster, playing some carefully chosen semi-religious tunes. For a while it seemed lovely and kind, but actually, quite quickly, it rather spoiled the contemplative mood this church might otherwise have generated. Good intentions pave the road to hell and all that. The ornate chancel arch is quite fun, as are the coloured marble font and pulpit, and the monuments, as you'd expect from a family church, are lavish. The Freemans, the Reedsdales, that's the Mitford lot. My goodness, our title system is complicated. Including Frances Elizabeth Mitford, who funded the building of this church and died in 1866. Inexplicably, to me at least, the Mitfords, Reedsdales, set up a family pew at the back of the church with a hideous wooden screen to separate themselves from the locals. I can't think of anything more embarrassing than having to sit in this box, which the distinguished church architect Harry Stewart Goodhart Rendell described as the Holy Honourable's cupboard. I've always found it rather amusing how grandees so often find it necessary to separate themselves from the rest of the human race when worshipping their god. They went to all kinds of lengths, from flying causeways, as in Burford Priory, to box pews with high backs and sides. This one seems to me to have been an error. I seem to have been a bit grumpy about this place. I'm not at all sure I meant to be. It could have something to do with those signs everywhere, telling me to keep away. Hey-ho. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Batsford. It's an interesting little place. It's very definitely not a place to come and park your car and walk about. This is a private village, and therefore I think it's safe to say best not to come that way. Come instead to the Arboretum. It's a beautiful Arboretum to wander around and enjoy the church, which I think you'll agree is very beautiful. Slightly seesawing around in this episode, we're now moving south again to Bourton-on-the-Hill. It has one small drawback, which is that the main road that runs through it makes it feel a little restless. But we're going to show you around. Come with me. Somehow, during the great efforts we've made over the last few years to visit every village of interest in the north of the Cotswolds, in other words, north of the A40, and despite the fact that we had thought we'd made films about every one, somehow we missed Bourton-on-the-Hill. It's within sight of Moreton-in-Marsh and encircled by Blockley, Snow's Hill and several other amazing places, but we seem simply to have driven through it without stopping. And that is really the only downside to this lovely village. The A44, from Chipping Norton to the east to Evesham in the west, runs straight through the heart of Bourton-on-the-Hill. Trundling lorries and hundreds of cars roar past the beautiful 17th century cottages that line the steep high street from the top of the hill to the bottom. The pavements are narrow, and for the cottages on the south side, often sunk below road level, the traffic wheels are apparently at eye level while the locals sit in their ancient Cotswold sitting rooms. At one point, no doubt many decades if not centuries ago, one of the cottages extended its grounds over the pavement with a wall and entrance, forcing today's pedestrians to step into the amazingly busy road for 5 yards or so. If ever I saw a village that deserves a bypass, this is it. But then, perhaps, the locals don't want one. If we miss this lovely place, then surely almost everyone else will too, and that does have certain advantages. So, the High Street is largely made up of 17th century cottages, which would grace the streets of any village in the Cotswolds. At the top of the hill is an 18th century pub called the Horse and Groom, appropriately named, as the downs on the hills above the village have long since been the domain of training stables and gallops. We haven't visited the pub, but reports are very good, and it does have its own car park. Opposite the pub is the first of two big houses in the village, Manor Farmhouse. Looking out over the road and with clearly spectacular views of the countryside to the south and west, it appears to be a lovely place to live. Halfway down the street is a set of almshouses, which are dated 1831 and inscribed on the front with the legend, "The Retreat for the Aged." These were built by a rector of the village called Dr. S. W. Warnford. We'll be speaking more about him in a moment, as he is buried in the churchyard and was an extremely influential figure in the embryonic 19th century efforts to treat people with mental health disorders. At the bottom of the hill is the beautiful Bourton House, probably originally a 17th century house, but rebuilt and extended in the early 1700s. It's a splendid estate with outbuildings of spectacular beauty, including a brewhouse, stables and a huge barn, dating from much earlier. It has 1570 etched on the stone. It still contains its original 16th century timbers, and we can safely say its appearance has barely changed for 800 years. Such riches in such a short street. And then, of course, there's the church. Towards the top of the hill there's a lane to the south which takes a kind of U-shaped turn around the middle of the village, coming out again further down the high street. If you can find a place to park, and you may well not be able to, then on the lower stretch of the U there is a wicket gate at the bottom of some steps which will lead you up to the little church of St. Lawrence. If you look carefully at the top of the steps, you'll see a sign, obviously specially made, which looks like one of those signs warning you not to climb an electricity pole. It's designed to stop you encroaching on what appears to be just a bit of rough, unkempt ground, and it says, "Caution, bees at work." I love that sign, and it started my strong impression that the residents of this village have their hearts in the right place. The impression was magnified by the realization that the church had built a small extension to house a lovely modern loo, left open for passing pilgrims to use at their leisure. But I've decided not to mention that, as the Cotswold explorer has long held the view that telling people where they can eat, sleep or have a pee isn't in their remit. The church, originally late Norman, has, along with almost every church in the region, been substantially altered and added to. Wandering around, you will notice that much of the architectural structure has been chopped about. There's little unusual about this, but this church does seem to me to please the eye even more than many others. In 1826, galleries were installed by the builder Richard Hulls, who came from Chipping Campden, on behalf of the philanthropist Dr. Warnford we mentioned earlier. One gallery section still exists. Warnford was a huge benefactor to the tune of £70,000, a vast amount in the early 19th century, towards the building of what is still the world-famous mental hospital in Oxford, named after him. Whilst his motives and language in the description of the hospital were of their time, he was extremely influential in starting the process of understanding mental health. Of course, we have come a long way since then. He was rector here from 1810, where he lived frugally and gave a large part of his considerable fortune to charitable causes, including a school and almshouses in this village, as well as improvement to the church. In 1889, the chancel was restored and a new pulpit was provided by the prominent arts and crafts architect Edward, known as Guy, Dauber, who ran his practice here for a while at the very beginning of the 1890s. There's a very interesting stone screen at the eastern end of the south aisle, made from 14th century fragments, brought, it seems, from Morton-in-Marsh. The railed tomb in the churchyard is the final resting place of the rector Warnford, who died while still rector here in 1855. I do hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Bolton-on-the-Hill. We've had a really nice time here. There's this clear feeling of welcome. The notes in the church are all very friendly. It's all extremely good news. In the dim distance, you can see Morton-in-Marsh. So we're right in the centre of the great North Cotswolds. And finally, nearly back where we started, we visit the little village of Hatherop, where the castle has a particularly poignant memory for me. This little village I first visited when I was really small, about 2 or 3 years old, because my sister was at school in Hatherop Castle behind me. I have to admit, I don't remember a single thing about it, so I'm having just as much fun as you discovering it. We're going to show you around. Come with me. On our journey down the River Colne, we've been constantly surprised and enthralled by the beauty of the little villages on its banks. It really is one of the most wonderful rivers in England. We come now to Hatherop, a small village with a big history, and a place that has a slightly weird place in my own life. Many, many years ago, my sister Kate was sent away to boarding school here, aged about 14, making me only 4. She was then, as she is now, my biggest idol and favourite sibling, and I missed her terribly. My mother comforted me with a description of Hatherop Castle, as the school was called then, as it is now, as a romantic place where she would be very happy. So it is associated for me with mixed feelings, a sense of loss, but also a sense of pleasure that my lovely sister will be happy in her beautiful castle. Of course, since then, I've discovered she was anything but. Our English boarding school system really does seem more than a little archaic these days. In the early 1950s, it was just the thing to do for people like us whose parents worked so much of their lives abroad. Pretty miserable for all concerned, frankly, including the parents. Anyway, enough of that. Hatherop sits above the river, and the story of this place is more about the land, the families who owned and cared for it, than the buildings that sit on it. For a start, the castle isn't a castle. It's a splendid house with a castellated tower, but whilst the tower is probably medieval, the building was severely damaged by fire in 1844, just a few years ago by the standards of this part of the world, and completely rebuilt, starting in 1850, by the architect Henry Clutton, an expert in French medieval architecture. In 1854, whilst the castle rebuild was still going on, Clutton also rebuilt the church next door, along with his protégé, William Burgess, whose influence is clearly seen in the mortuary South Chapel, on behalf of the de Morley family. A white marble effigy of Barbara, Lady de Morley, who died in 1844, lies in the chapel. In the mid-19th century, the whole 3,000-acre estate was bought by a wealthy cotton spinner from Lancashire called Bazley. Bazley's heir was his son Sir Thomas Stafford Bazley, who was born in 1907 and came of age in 1928. He lived at Hatherop until the house was requisitioned for military use in 1941. He was married in 1945, but any idea of returning to live at Hatherop Castle in the pre-war manner, with dozens of staff to look after them and a life of largely leisurely pursuits, must have seemed impossibly remote. Have we not seen that very situation discussed in detail in the television series Downton Abbey recently? And in 1946 he leased the house for use as the aforementioned girls' secondary school and went to live at East Leach Downs Farm on the estate, where he became an early advocate for organic farming. He eventually sold the freehold of Hatherop Castle to the school in 1972, but retained the rest of the estate intact, maintaining a close control over the villages of Hatherop and East Leach, so as to preserve the rural way of life and a community spirit, until he died in 1997. In this time of great uncertainty in the rural life of England, with the government apparently determined to undermine the patchwork of ownership that has served us so well over the last few hundred years, this determination of his perhaps seems to us particularly admirable. His children, keen to honour his commitment to the integrity of the estate, but needing to turn the estate into cash, sold it in 2002 to the locally based Ernest Cook Trust, which already owned the adjacent Fairford Park estate. Now, the Ernest Cook Trust is a great organisation, teaching young people about country management and giving many who would never otherwise have it the opportunity to experience country activities. I happen to know that now, at the beginning of 2025, the Trust is looking for a river manager to look after the stretch of the Colne that comes with the estate. If only I was 20 years younger. The village of Hatherop grew up around the castle, some built by the Ponsonby family and more added later by the Paisley family. The cottages opposite the path that leads to the church are dated 1868 and are particularly nice. Having revisited Hatherop, I think I have completely discarded my resentment towards the place for removing my sister, and heartily recommend a walk along the banks of the Colne, with the castle looming above and the countryside warming the soul. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Hatherop. It's been great for me to revisit because the name is sort of sentimental to me because my sister was here at school when I was just a tiny child. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Press the little bell icon so that we can let you know whenever we post something. And we will see you again very soon, somewhere else in the Cotswolds.